Yeah, I wanted to get your thoughts on a specific kind of angle to some of the computational stuff that we've been doing lately.
Sure. It's always, I don't, I knew that you would have something on your mind, but I was busy racking my brains trying to think, what is it that we're going to be talking about? And then I thought, well, it doesn't matter. With you, it's always interesting. So I'll just see what it is, and then we'll take it from there. So what is it that's on your mind?
All right, thanks. So here's what I have. We have a preprint, and this is Adam Goldstein and Taining Zhang, a student of mine, and I have a preprint on the following. What I wanted to do was to address this issue of non-obvious cognitive properties in very simple systems. Okay, and I like this kind of stuff, and so the thing that I chose specifically was sorting algorithms. So these are very simple algorithms that computer scientists have, all CS students study these, and so I'll just give you a very quick a rundown of what we had found. And so they're a good model system because they're fully deterministic. So they're completely transparent. It's 6 lines of code or so. So there's nowhere to hide. In biology, there's always yet more mechanism that could be involved. But here you see all the steps of the algorithm. Fully deterministic, very, very simple. Everybody knows, everybody thinks they know what they're capable of. Everybody's been studying them. It's very obvious. And so I thought, okay, let's see if we can find any surprises there, and we made a couple of tweaks to be able to study them from this basal cognition perspective, and then I think there may be sort of a psychoanalytic perspective here that I want to probe with your opinions on. So the first thing we did is we just visualized, so the way they work is you start with a string of integers, let's say 100 integers, they're jumbled up in random order. And what the algorithms are going to do is eventually sort them into order so that it's monotonic from 1 to 100. And so what you can do is you can visualize the progression of any given string in that space. It starts off somewhere over here where it's quite random, and then they all sort of move to a spot where, in fact, guaranteed to move to a spot where everybody's in the same order. So what you can do is you can plot this notion of sortedness, how well sorted a given string is, and you see that over time it increases. So okay, so that's the journey through space that this thing is taking. That's the space it lives in, and now we can ask a couple of interesting questions. The first question that we asked was, in James's sense of delayed gratification. In other words, if we put a barrier in its place, is it capable of moving backwards away from its goal in order to reap gains later on? The business with the 2 magnets separated by a piece of wood versus Romeo and Juliet separated and so on. So keep in mind that in these algorithms, there is nothing like that. There is nothing explicitly in the algorithm about, if you come upon a barrier, then you should temporarily back off. There's nothing like that. We kept the algorithms exactly as they are. The way we do a barrier is we simulate a broken cell. So every cell has a certain number, and the algorithm says move the 4 and the 5, But what happens if one of them is broken? They won't move. If they won't move, and this breaks an assumption in these algorithms. Usually, you assume that the hardware is reliable. If the algorithm says swap the numbers, they swap. And in fact, the algorithm doesn't have any logic built in to see, wait, did it swap or didn't it? It doesn't have any of that. It assumes, it just goes on its merry way, assuming that what it said actually took place. We said, well, biology isn't like that. You have the biological medium is notoriously unreliable and noisy. But specifically, if we put a barrier, you're going along and you're sorting, all of a sudden you need to move this number to get to improve things, but it won't move. It's broken. And there's one of 2 ways it could be broken. Either it could refuse to be moved at all, or it could refuse to request to be moved. We'll deal with that momentarily. But anyway, let's say it's broken. And so what we found is that these algorithms, despite the fact of not having any specific code for it, when they do come to a barrier like this, they back off, meaning the sortedness actually drops. The string becomes less sorted. They do some other stuff. They move other numbers around, and then eventually they go around and things improve. And so they have some ability for this kind of delayed gratification. They can back away from their goal in order to reap gains later on, and they have a little horizon that they're willing to, they're willing and able to do that. So that was kind of the first thing we found, and that's not really the thing I want to focus on, but I thought I would, say it just in case you had anything interesting to say about that. So there's this interesting new
Can I pause you for a moment? Sorry, I just want to be sure I'm following correctly, Mike. So this algorithm, is it a stepwise procedure or is it an end goal that it's, in other words, is it aiming for the end goal, the totally sorted sequence, or is it just following the steps that are coded?
It's the steps. It is not an explicit goal-directed loop at all. Basically, it has certain criteria. It says, look at some numbers, and then based on that, shuffle the numbers, and that's it. Now, it just so happens that if you execute that long enough, you will eventually end up with a string. But there is no logic in there. There is no logic that asks, how are we doing? Did it work? How are we doing? Is it sorted? There isn't any of that. There's no self-monitoring. There's nothing like that.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
So, okay, the second thing we did is instead, so the usual, the way these algorithms are usually done is that there's a centralized controller that's sort of godlike, can see the whole string and is following the algorithm and is moving numbers around. So what we did was we got rid of that and we said instead each individual cell is following the algorithm. So the 4 wants a 5 on its right and the 3 on its left, and each individual cell has preferences about what its neighbors are, but there is no single central controller that sees the whole thing. And if you do that, it still works, and it's fine. It still works. So that's interesting. You can make it sort of bottom up and distributed in that way. But that also allows you to do an interesting thing, which you couldn't do before, which is you can make a chimeric string. You can make a string, an array of numbers composed of numbers that are actually following different algorithms. So we looked at there are three different sorting algorithms that we used: selection sort, insertion sort, and bubble sort, they're called. So normally you have one algorithm and you're following that one algorithm to move the numbers around. But now that the numbers are moving themselves around, what you can say is, well, some number of them are going to be following this policy, some of them are going to be following that policy. And if you do that, it also still works, meaning that they don't all have to be following the same policy. But here's the crazy part. Imagine you have now an array of 100 cells, and each of those cells has a number to it. That's what you're sorting. You're sorting on that number, and they're starting out randomly. What we did was to assign algorithms to each of those cells randomly, one of two. So Adam came up with a nice name for it. He calls it an algotype, the way you have a genotype and a phenotype. Now every cell has an algotype. The algotype is either bubble sort or it's insertion sort. That's it. And the algotypes are also selected randomly. Now we ask a simple question. During the lifetime of this array, as it's doing its sorting thing, what's the internal structure like? That is, what is the probability that any given cell looks to its neighbor and says, oh, he's just like me, same algotype as me? What's the probability of that? Now, in the beginning, that probability is 50% because we assign algotypes to numbers randomly. So you know that it's a 50-50 whether the guy next to you is same as you. At the end of this thing, it's also random because at the end, we're sorting on digits, on the digit values, and we know that the assignment of digit values to algotypes is random. So at the end, it's also going to be random. But now the question is, what does it do in the middle? And what we find that it does in the middle is if this is time here and this is 50% it's here, it starts out at 50%, it goes up, and then it comes back down. In other words, what happens during the sorting is that cells tend to cluster next to ones like them. They tend to cluster next to their own kin, basically. Now, keep in mind, in the algorithm, there is no code in the algorithm. What algotype am I? What algotype is my neighbor? I want to go sit next to this one. I don't like sitting next to that one. There's nothing like that in there. If you examine the physics of the system determined by the algorithm itself, you don't see any of that. The only time you see this is if you actually if we actually look and ask this question of we know what their algotypes are, and we say so in a certain sense. So you can probably see why I started thinking about analysis, because it's what we are doing is uncovering a hidden cause of their behavior that is to them not apparent at all. We can see that, oh, you're clustering in a particular way. There's a behavioral pattern that we're identifying here, but it isn't explicitly coded by anything that, if they were to examine their own code, or if anybody would examine their own code, there's nothing in the code that says that. So there are a few interesting things here that I really like. One is that it's a kind of it's an extremely minimal metaphor for this existential condition of living things, where eventually in this universe, the inexorable force of the algorithm is going to pull apart all of those clustered pieces, because in the end everybody's got to get sorted according to their number. So eventually the physics grinds you down and sort of undoes whatever organization you had at the beginning. But during the process, you have some amount of time where, in a way consistent with the physics, I mean, there's no magic, you're following the algorithm, but there's an interesting behavioral tendency is that you're able to satisfy for some period of time during your lifetime. And it's something that simultaneously is, it's not against the algorithm that you're following. It's consistent with it, but it's not specified in the algorithm. And for some amount of time, it's actually at cross purposes, because you're being, your behavior, you're keeping things together that eventually are going to need to be pulled apart. We also did one more experiment. We asked, how strong is this tendency to keep together? Because one way you can one way you can ask that is by allowing repeat digits. If I allow repeat digits, let's say there's we have 100 total, and every digit can occur 10 times. So there's only 10 digits total. There's 10 fives, 10 sixes, and so on. If you do that, what happens is then you can kind of satisfy both. In other words, in a run of 10 fives, they can be where they're supposed to be, but 5 of them could be one algotype and 5 of them could be the other. So it sort of makes it possible for you to retain the clustering while still be consistent with the algorithm. And if you do that, they cluster even more, which shows that these things are actually somewhat at cross purposes. If you take off the pressure, if you allow them to do what they really want to do, which is to be clustered, the clustering goes up. Yeah. So I'm interested in this, in your thoughts on, just in general, this notion of a system. This is an extremely simple one, but of course, you and I are both interested in minimal agents and so on. These kinds of explicit drives and behaviors that aren't in the algorithm, that are emergent, that are not obvious, but that can be discovered if we take seriously the study of how this thing reacts in the problem space that it's working in. And if we don't assume for the moment that it's even though it's deterministic and so on, that we don't assume that it's this dumb thing that only does what the algorithm says. It really made me feel like yeah, we were uncovering these hidden motivations for the patterns in its behavior that, well, it's not complex enough to, of course, realize it, but we can see them. So yeah, I don't know. What do you think about all
that? Well, first of all, as always, I don't know how you come up with the problems that you spend your time on. You have the most extraordinarily creative mind. So I just, as you tell the story, I'm thinking, this is Mike Levin. Nobody else is going to have this conversation with you ever. Are we getting some sort of interference?
No, I'm trying to shut off. Somebody's texting me, and I'm trying to
okay.
Shut it off. Yeah.
So I was thinking it through and trying to understand why it would do what it's doing. And obviously, I don't know the algorithms, but it was sort of making sense to me. That why these emergent behaviors, I was thinking there are ways in which I can understand this would happen. For example, your own algo type is probably more predictable. If it's functioning by the same principle that you are, you will prefer to operate in a space that is understandable to, that behaves in the way that you expect, and there's less work required from you. So also, how that comes about made a sort of a putative sense to me. Then when you asked the question, with it, what you were describing was, of course, emergent properties of the system, as you later labeled it yourself. But then you asked this very interesting question about when you say you're linking it to, you're saying to psychoanalysis, but really it's broader than psychoanalysis. It's a system that has explicit and implicit principles. And so it's really the model I would use is a general sort of multiple memory systems sort of model, and where there are non-declarative and declarative modules. And then I was thinking in that it works in the reverse of what you've described, in the sense that what is non-declarative is the more bottom up. It's the more sort of predetermined, and what is declarative, what is explicit, is the more emergent. What couldn't be predicted and needs to be dealt with on the fly is what is explicit. So it's an interesting, I mean, the fact that you drew that analogy, which I have to say I wouldn't even have thought of. Again, this is why I'm saying this is Mike Levin. You have to remember that you're Mark Solms and that's Mike Levin, and now you've got to start thinking differently. But since you made that connection, which I wouldn't have made, I find it interesting that for me it would, what I would call the emergent part is the part that's explicit. So explicit in the cognitive sense, as opposed to explicit in the coding sense. In other words, this was explicitly coded, but this behavior emerges. What I think is explicitly coded in our multiple memory systems is what is non-declarative, and what is implicit and emergent is what is declarative, because that's where the uncertainty is. That's where the unpredictability is, which links with my way of thinking about consciousness, which is that it's felt uncertainty. It's now, why do I think that the non-declarative systems are equivalent to your explicit coding? I think so I'm trying to unpack my own intuition. Why do I have that intuition? Well, first of all, I could link it to what I've just said, in that, which is a kind of functionalist account, in that what is implicit is what is more certain, in the memory sense of the word. In other words, let me use the word non-declarative, so then it's clearer that I'm talking about memory systems. So the non-declarative systems are non-declarative because one has a high confidence in those beliefs, that they're not subject to review. This is always the same. So in terms of a hierarchical predictive model, you're talking about the layers in the hierarchy, which are simpler and more generalizable. The way I think of a predictive hierarchy, by the way, I don't normally picture it as a pyramid. I picture it as a concentric onion. And I think of the core of the onion as the deepest layers of the predictive model. And that's where there's the greatest confidence. So the simplest, most generalizable predictions are at the core. And as you move to the periphery, so you're dealing with eventualities on the fly. So one of the reasons why I think of the non-declarative systems as the explicit in the sense of pre-programmed is because they are more, there's more predetermination, a higher confidence, more generalizability, and a simpler algorithm is being followed down there. And of course, the converse applies to the periphery. Another reason that I think that way is because I think that the non-declarative memory systems are the ones that function most like reflexes and instincts, which are the pre-programmed predictions. These are the predictions that are determined by natural selection. As we automatize our acquired predictions, so they function more like reflexes and instincts. They're more automatized. They're more unconscious. They're more predictable. They are simpler. They're more generalizable. And the periphery of the predictive model is specialized for complexity, for context sensitivity, so that's where the uncertainty is. It's also, in other words, it's what is more acquired. It is what is more unique to me here and now, as opposed to what is generally true of all versions of my type, with things that always function that way. So the meaning of the word explicit and implicit in memory systems terms is the opposite of the meaning of the terms in the way that we are using them in your emergent properties of your system. So those are my initial thoughts, but it links to an issue that is extremely interesting, and I think cuts to the heart of the whole problem of consciousness, which is, what do we mean by explicit? Why does anything become explicit in the sense that the system now has to monitor its own states? I think that is so I'm, as you know, I'm working on an artificial consciousness project myself, and in the computational architecture that we're designing and adjusting as we go along, this is one of the problems we're busy tackling right now. We can make our agent function perfectly well without there being any obvious sort of distinction between what is explicit and what is implicit. And we have to kind of introduce that in order to try and get what we're calling biological plausibility, but it actually has two different meanings. The one is to get it to function like I expect it has to, and that's not biological plausibility, it's Marx-Solms plausibility. And the other is to make it function more like a, vertebrate brain. What we know about how, well, actually more mammalian brains is what I'm using as my sort of starting point. But in other words, a brain with cortex. So we're having to introduce a constraint, on the way that it works in order to try to make this distinction between what is explicit and what is implicit, which is, of course, a very bad way of going about doing things. And then I realized that as we were doing that it's due to a concrete way of thinking. Of course, there can be this functional distinction in the system doesn't have to actually coincide with its architecture. In other words, you mustn't map the architecture onto your concepts. The concepts of what functions it's performing, like what you're talking about now, these emergent properties, they're not in any of the code. They're not in any of the modules in your flow diagram, but nevertheless they emerge, they exist. These distinctions exist without them being coded for, and without them coinciding with the brute structure of the algorithm or the structure of the program. But that issue of the meaning of explicit in the consciousness sense of the word, it's the issue. Why does anything have to become explicit? What does explicitness do? It has, I think, to do with when a system is uncertain about its own states. and therefore has to focus on monitoring of its own states. But nevertheless, we come back to the problem that I started with in my response to you, which is that it is the opposite meaning of the terms end up having diametrically opposite meaning. The meaning of explicit and implicit in the phenomenological sense, as opposed to in the functional architecture sense, or what is explicitly coded and what emerges. Those are my thoughts about that problem. Does that resonate with you, or lead you to any interesting places?
Yeah, super interesting. I hadn't realized about the inversion. I think that's incredibly important. And I wonder if tracking down when so we can sort of look at the kinds of systems that we're working in as like one end of the spectrum, the very minimal kind, and then over here is, the sort of thing, the mammalian brain you're trying to model. One wonders whether that inversion takes place somewhere along that spectrum, right? And whether that's some sort of phase transition, or whether it's a gradual flip, or I don't know yet, because I'm just taking this on now. But yeah, the fact that it's backwards, I wonder if that is actually an important criterion for some of the things that we are interested in, to distinguish truly simple models that don't have whatever properties from, okay, now you're into something that's a true agent. Maybe that flip is important to that. And so that's the first thing. So I need to think harder about this inverted mapping. And then the other thing is that, this question, which we wrestle with all the time in our models, is like, yeah, what do you bake in to make it do whatever it's supposed to do? I mean, in our example, what keeps striking me is that the thing that we've observed, and who knows what else, right? So I'm sure there's other things to observe. We're just not smart enough to test for them yet. This clustering was just something that we thought of to do, but I'm sure there's other things to do. It doesn't have any real, like, we didn't have to do anything for that to emerge, meaning it isn't there's nothing in the algorithm that remotely is about optimizing that. So to some extent, this apparent the apparent tendency of the system to optimize a particular behavior is completely emergent. We didn't have to do anything. And so one wonders, as we think about, okay, how do we construct things like that? Maybe a lot of it we don't construct. Maybe I don't know where it comes from, right? But maybe it really emerges under extremely minimal conditions, and that it makes me think that if something as dumb as a 6-line sorting algorithm can have these unexpected behavioral tendencies that have to be discovered by experiment, that we cannot predict in advance, the more complicated things we make, who knows what they're doing, right? It's like that's part of why I started this, is because I wanted to have an extremely simple system.
Yeah.
And it seems like already there you have this kind of, and I mean, the thing you started with, it's amazing, because it took me probably a couple of months to realize what you said, right off the bat at the beginning, which is that what it looks like they're doing is they're minimizing uncertainty about their neighbors, right? Because having a neighbor who's like you means that, yeah. So I eventually got there too, but that took me a couple of months to realize. And actually, Carl and I talked about it a few weeks ago. The thing about that, and I think that's a perfectly reasonable explanation, the thing about it is that there is nothing in the algorithm about that. There's nothing about making predictions, testing. We're actually doing some experiments right now to see like how many interactions they have before they cluster. Do they actually have to spend some time with each other before they realize that, hey, this one's just like me? So, but all of that is completely emergent. So I just, this thing, if it wasn't already fundamental enough, this surprise minimization principle, it seems now even more, just baked in. You don't need to do much of anything. You get that, just from extremely minimal systems.
Yeah. So I don't know if there's a literature on this. Suddenly what you just said made me realize that this principle of preferring to be in the neighborhood of agents that function like me because they are more predictable. They reduce my uncertainty. It makes me realize with a sort of chill down my spine that this is obviously part of prejudice. You know, why people want to be with their own kind, you know, is that they're more predictable. You know what's going on, you know what to do, you know what to expect, and being with others, you know, in the social sense, it makes you uncertain, and therefore increases your free energy, and therefore you don't want to be there. I say it sends a chill down my spine because it makes me realize how, you know, how little prospect one has of being able to engineer, socially engineer this out of us. The only way to do it is to make sure we all have a common enemy. So, but that's a sort of a side thought. As I say, I don't know if anybody has said that. Maybe that's generally recognized to be the case, but for me, I've only discovered that in my own mind right now in this conversation.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's amazing that something like that is present at the very bottom of, you know, it didn't take much. It didn't take any evolution at all, in fact, to come upon this, right? But it actually, this idea actually cropped up about a month ago. Some colleagues and I were discussing, you know, AI and diverse intelligence and all that, and what we had a lot of debates about. This sort of spectrum. You can imagine the sort of spectrum where on one end it's things like objectophilia, right, where you sort of completely mistake the amount of agency in whatever system you're dealing with, and you fall in love with a bridge or an Eiffel Tower or something. You know, people do, of course, which are, you know, sort of not at the level that you think they are. But so that's one type of error, but the other type of error is exactly what you just said, which basically, you know, if you're too strict about saying, well, I don't believe, you know, you don't have the origin story or composition that I do, and therefore I don't think you have a real mind. I think you're, you know, faking it, as what they say about certain age. I mean, the far end of that is something like only love your own kind, right? That's what you were just saying, you know, that so we wanted, so we spent a lot of time talking about how we could arrive at principal strategies for picking criteria along that, because you don't want to be at either one of these, you know, either one of these poles. You want to match, sort of impedance match the kind of relationship you have with a system to what, and I firmly believe that even in the absence of, you know, aliens and whatnot, we're going to be surrounded by really radically different systems. We're going to have to like work on getting this right. So I you know, from that perspective, yeah, I completely agree with you that this is an important thing to get right. And I think our fundamental, you know, that surprise minimization. But I wonder, you know, I wonder if one thing you can do to alter how this works is to sort of reframe what it is that you're measuring. Let's assume for a minute that yes, you don't want surprises. You want to you want it predictable. But now the question is, what about? And so if we can get away from superficial kinds of differences that drive, you know, social, you know, distress and stuff like that, and focus on fundamental things, then maybe this can actually make sense. So you know, what I would like to be surrounded by is what, you know, humans with the same DNA. That's not what I'm measuring. Maybe we measure something else. Maybe we measure kindness or pro-adaptive, you know, pro-social behaviors, or somebody who has the same kind of existential concerns that I do, or something like that, right? So shift the measurables in a way that it's actually, you know, it's actually better. I don't know. That's where I've been trying to think about how to create principled strategies for
that. So think where you just put it, it is very much a concern of mine as I'm working on this artificial consciousness. The prejudice of it's not like me, therefore it can't have this valuable thing that I've got. I'm very exercised by. I mean, in my field, I have it even with colleagues who won't acknowledge consciousness in creatures which are too far from us in terms of their phenotype, um, let alone artificial agents. The prejudice is just enormous. And so it's interesting to link that with what we've just been talking about. Again, I hadn't thought of that. The solution that we mammals at least have come to that functions in the other direction is an epistemophilic inclination. That it's important to approach what is uncertain. A positive attraction to gaining more knowledge, and therefore to engaging with what is novel, with what is not understood, with what is it's what becomes interesting. So there's the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine system functions like that in the mammalian brain. Its homeostatic set point is to be in a state of uncertainty. It's in homeostatic deviation. If it's bored, if everything's predictable, then that need is not being met. The need to engage with novelty. It's a sort of what makes us forage. It's what makes us explore. It's what makes people like you and me exist at all. That we're constantly attracted to what is not known, and you can see over longer timescales the biological advantage of that, because to engage with uncertainty is in the long term to reduce uncertainty. So the world's not going to bite you in the butt in future because you engaged with it now proactively. But then an entirely different line of thought that was triggered in me as I was listening to what you were saying is that really what you're talking about is a sort of swarm intelligence, isn't it? Where each creature has a very limited range of behaviors, and then although each one of them is doing this very limited thing, what emerges is very complex behaviors by the swarm as a whole. So there's no master program in each member of the swarm, but the swarm as a whole produces this much more intricate outcome that maps onto what you were talking about in terms of your algorithm and the interesting emergent behaviors that you described to me. But then I realized that this links actually to one of your basic concerns, which is that we multicellular creatures are all of us actually swarms of cells. And so this is, but we're not swarms of equal cells. We have nerve cells and bone cells and so on, which are specialized for. In some respects, of course, they are all of them just animal cells, but in another sense, they're not. So you do end up having sort of master controllers in the nerve cells, for example, in relation to other cells. So it's not we are not just a swarm. We're some. There's interesting ways in which you can understand the cooperation between all of our individual cells in the on the model, on the analogy of a swarm, but there are other ways in which that analogy breaks down. Then the other thought that was sparked in me by what you were just saying is at what point is one justified in speaking of cognition? I mean, what does the term cognition refer to really? If you have a very simple algorithm that always does exactly the same thing, where none of this kind of emergent behavior of the kind you've just described happens. Is that cognition of a very, very, very basal kind? Or does one only have a reason to speak of cognition once emergent behaviors, once there are novel problems, or at least novel phenomena, novel computations which are not, to go back to the very beginning of our conversation, which are not written into the code, computations which are implicit in the sense that we were using, which are emergent in the sense that we were using those two terms. Does that qualify as cognition? And if it does, bearing in mind my own beliefs about what constitutes consciousness, and you and I have spoken about this many times before, functionally, what constitutes what is probably definitional functionally of a conscious agent is an agent which can solve novel problems. It has to have some way of feeling its way through the problem. In other words, of monitoring, is this going well or is this going badly? Because it's not written into my DNA, as it were. This is something that I've never that I have no predictions for. I now have to predict the present, and how do you do that? Well, you have to palpate how well or badly is this going, and then you have to change your mind. That's my, I mean, putting it in very simplified terms, that's my criterion for what is plausibly potentially a conscious agent. But now I realize in saying that then there's no distinction between what qualifies as something called cognition and what qualifies as something called consciousness. The only way I could find a justification for continuing to use those words differently is that there are operations which become automatized, which were once not there. So in other words, something rises to the level of explicit in the psychological sense of the word, one has of feeling your way through the problem. Then you learn from the experience and you lay down new predictions which can become very confident and automatized predictions. So they're the products of consciousness, but they are not in the present functioning consciously. So those, I think, it makes sense to me that you would have to call those cognitive operations because they're the products of learning. But the actual work of learning, the actual learning from experience, with the emphasis on the word experience, that part is conscious cognition. It's working memory as opposed to long-term memory, which is now I lay down a prediction on the basis of the predictive work that I did.
Mm-hmm.
But let me ask you that question that I began with. What would your definition of cognition be, in the sense that you're looking for basal cognition? What constitutes cognition as opposed to rote following a program?
Yeah, so I agree with you. I think it's fundamentally about problem solving and feeling your way through a problem, and specifically in vulnerable creatures, because it's different if you are a composite being that is in danger of falling apart into your component pieces. It becomes a whole other business. Feeling your way through problems as a whole other business to it. And I think that's what we mean by cognition. And I'm willing to, as you know, I'm willing to take it very basally. I don't think it has to be the complex metacognitive stuff that we have. But what I'm realizing now is that I'm not sure if there are any, my initial intuition was like yours, that there would be there would be rote kinds of things, and then there would be these like more complex emergent things. I'm not sure there are any of the first part anymore. And the reason I say that is because if you were to look at these algorithms, how much more rote can you get? They are fully deterministic. There's not even a pseudo-random number call there. They are completely deterministic. They are completely transparent. They're very simple. There is no more hidden mechanism of biology to look at. Same thing with our gene regulatory networks that we showed could have 6 different kinds of learning. Just again, there's just a couple differential equations. So if from something as dumb and simple as this, we can already see the ability to solve new problems, meaning go around the barriers and right. And we can already see that they are optimizing things that are nowhere explicitly provided a mechanism for, like minimizing distinction from your neighbor. I mean, I don't know that there are any that don't have that. I mean, maybe we could try to come up with some, but it makes me, even if we were to come up with something extremely dumb, I don't know that our failure to find these kind of properties is anything but a lack of imagination on our part. We could come up with some sort of bit adder or something that just adds bits, and we'd say, okay, surely this thing doesn't do anything else other than this. We can call, and maybe, but having seen this in sorting algorithms, that distance has gotten really thin. And now I'm starting to wonder if our inability to observe it in simple things is just lack of imagination, and our evolutionary training on very complicated things where we're just we're not good at seeing. So I don't know. And of course it leads me to this kind of sort of a more panpsychist view where these kind of properties to me look like they're baked in at the very beginning, maybe wherever mathematics comes from, I don't know, but baked in very early on. And then the other thing I feel strongly about is that we have to do experiments. So we cannot just observationally look at something and say, well, I can see it. This thing is dumb. It's not going to do anything. I think we're not good at that at all. I don't think it's possible anyway, but I think we're just bad at it. And we need to do experiments. We need to do barriers. We need to try various kinds of training techniques. We need to see what is this thing doing when we give it a little leeway, but yeah, what does it look like from its perspective? And you also said something very, very interesting about, like, yeah, you can treat this thing as a distributed agent from the cell's point of view, and from the cell's point of view, okay, who are my neighbors and all of that. But somebody, and it might have been Carl or it might have been Adam, but somebody was saying the other day when we were talking about this, look at it from the cluster's point of view, because in forming these clusters, maybe we do have a temporary higher level of organization. There's a sure, it's dynamic, meaning pieces come and go, but so are we. We're a molecular ship of Theseus and a cellular one, right? So we come and go too, and maybe there's another story to tell from the perspective of each cluster as to what the world looks like. So that's where I've been recently is really thinking about how to see the world from the perspective of these weird agents, and what does it look like? What is it like to be? So I don't think it's a crazy question to ask. What's it like to be a chunk of data being sorted? I don't, what's it like to be the sorting algorithm? What's it like? I'm sort of now open to that. That gets back to your, the consciousness question, like there may be inner perspectives of like valuable inner perspectives in all of these things. I don't know.
Yeah. Since our very first conversations, I've told you that you've made me much more radical than when already I was in trouble in relation to my colleagues, in reducing everything to what the vertebrate brainstem is capable of. But you've persuaded me that it goes way, way, way lower than that, in terms of what is plausibly a cognitive and plausibly a conscious system. I also always end up finding that there can't be a sharp dividing line, at which point it becomes, so there has to be a gradation. One has to speak of proto-consciousness or proto-cognition, and that has to go all the way down. So I'm with you there. It's not entirely the same as panpsychism, but it's difficult to say in which way it's not panpsychism. But now let me, in trying to not be a panpsychist, let me take it a step further. And it goes back to what we were saying a few minutes ago in this conversation, when I was saying, in one respect, we composite creatures are just a swarm of cells. And each cell is just doing its, it's from the cell's point of view, it's just, this is what I do. It's what I always do. There's no cognition going on here. I always do exactly the same thing. And then you could say, well, from the cluster's point of view, so where the emergent behaviors arise, or from the swarm's point of view, what Adam or Carl had said to you, well, what is it like from the point of view of being the swarm? Or what is it like from the point of view of being the cluster? That is one way of going. But another way of going is back to the point I made when I said there's ways in which we are not a swarm. In that we do have master cells and slave cells, and they're not on all fours. They're not all doing the same thing. Once you start to have cells within this cluster or cells within this swarm that are monitoring at a higher level than the soldiers. I'm thinking of ants now. Once you have generals and soldiers, then you maybe you then can more justifiably speak of the mental process as being at the level of the organizing, overseeing, overarching cells than not every cell then has equal dignity in terms of its cognitiveness.
That gives me a really interesting idea that we should try experimentally in our system, which is we can make some of the cells more powerful than others. We can let them see a little bit further, or we can let them push a little harder in terms of where they want to go, and see what effect that has. If we right now everybody's equal, but I see your point. I think it's very interesting. If there are regionalizations like that, I wonder if we will see some sort of substructure within the. I'm sort of visualizing a nervous system within the cluster, right? So you have a cluster, and there's a pattern of the more powerful cells within the sort of organizing. Like, I'm making this up. I don't know if this will happen or not, but I can sort of imagine, right, a temporary almost nervous system. I think we'll do that. I'll talk.
Very interesting. We'll do that. It makes my mind suddenly leap back to your worms, and I remember that there was. I forget exactly the anatomy that you told me about, but there was something about something like the epithelial cells had functionality that the intestinal cells didn't have. I forget, as I say, what the anatomy was, but you could grow a new worm from some cells, and you could not grow a new worm from other cells.
Well, the worms. So the worms, they have a population of adult stem cells, and if you cut a piece that has even one of these stem cells in it, you will get, you can get a whole worm. If you cut a piece, and there are regions of the animal where you can cut off, like the tip of the nose has no stem cells in it. If you cut off that tip of the nose, it will not, it will. But I think it's a matter of the hardware and not the information, because so these stem cells are the source of new cell types. They produce the stuff you need to make a proper worm, right? But I don't think they carry much of the information, because we've done another experiment, and this is not published yet, but we know what the answer is. When you take a little piece out of a two-headed worm and you irradiate it like crazy to kill all of the stem cells that are in it, and you take just those somatic cells and you shove it into the body of a one-headed worm, under some percentage of the time, what ends up happening is that one-headed worm now becomes converted to be two-headed. So that information did not require the stem cells. It did not require new cell types. The transplant, in fact, will all die. Those cells only live 30 days or so, but the information lives on. And so I think there's a real distinction here about what you need to know what to do versus what do you need to actually build, the body of the worm.